Thomas sat quietly at the edge of the dock, staring out at the calm water. The soft light of early morning reflected off the bay, making it look like the ocean was made of gold. His small boat, an old but reliable fishing vessel, bobbed gently in the water. He had been coming to this harbor for years. The smell of salt water and the sound of seagulls in the distance were comforting, a reminder of days spent in the Navy. It was his way to escape, to remember the peace that he had fought for all those years ago. Today, however, there was a feeling in the air that something wasn't quite right. Thomas couldn't shake the strange sensation as he tied the ropes to his boat. The breeze was soft, almost too still, and the silence felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. He shrugged it off. Maybe it was just his mind playing tricks on him, like it did sometimes. After all, he was used to the quiet mornings, and nothing had ever gone wrong before. He pushed his boat into the water, feeling the familiar tug of the rope as he slowly drifted away from the dock. The water was cool and smooth, and for a moment, Thomas closed his eyes, letting the rhythm of the waves calm his thoughts. Out here, he was alone, free from the world, free from everything but the sea. As he took a deep breath, he heard a distant hum, faint at first, like the sound of a motor. Thomas frowned and looked over his shoulder. In the distance, a sleek white yacht was cutting through the water, moving faster than he expected for a boat of that size. It wasn't uncommon for bigger boats to pass through the bay, but this one seemed different. Its size and speed made it look out of place in the calm waters of the harbor. Thomas didn't think much of it at first. After all, yachts were a normal sight around here. Rich people often came to relax, not caring much for the smaller boats nearby. But the hum grew louder and closer. The yacht was heading straight for him, its motor roaring as it sliced through the water. Thomas tensed. He looked around. There was nowhere to go. His boat was small, and it would be impossible to avoid the larger, faster vessel. He tried to steer his boat away from its path, but the yacht was coming in too quickly. It didn't slow down. Thomas's heart raced as he realized what was about to happen. Within seconds, the yacht was almost upon him. He could see the people on board, laughing, drinking, enjoying the luxury of their life, unaware of the disaster they were about to cause. And then, with a sickening crash, the yacht collided with Thomas's small boat, throwing him off balance. The sound of splintering wood filled the air, and in a blur of motion, Thomas was thrown into the water. The impact was sudden and violent. Thomas barely had time to react before his boat was rammed by the massive yacht. The force of the collision threw him off balance, sending him crashing into the cold water. The world around him spun as he gasped for air, trying to make sense of what just happened. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment, he struggled to stay afloat, his mind racing in panic. His boat, once a trusted companion, was now nothing more than a wreck. As he kicked his legs to keep above the water, he saw the yacht's wake, churning the calm sea around him. The massive ship didn't stop. It didn't slow down. It just kept moving forward, its powerful engine roaring as it left him behind. The people on board, dressed in expensive clothes, didn't seem to notice what had just happened. Thomas could hear their laughter carried by the wind, the sound of music blasting from the speakers, as though nothing was wrong. They were so far removed from the reality of the situation. Fighting the waves, Thomas swam back toward what was left of his boat. Splintered wood floated around him, pieces of the boat drifting away with the current. He grabbed onto a piece, his muscles burning as he clung to it. The boat he had worked so hard to maintain, the boat that had been his escape for so many years, was destroyed in an instant. It felt like everything he had worked for was just washed away. He wasn't sure how long he floated there, his mind numb with disbelief. Eventually, he managed to pull himself back onto the dock, shaking with cold and frustration. His clothes were soaked, and his hands trembled as he tried to steady himself. He looked out at the yacht, now a distant dot on the horizon. It was still moving, carefree, oblivious to the damage it had caused. Thomas took a deep breath, wiping his face with the back of his hand. The anger began to build inside him, sharp and fiery. This wasn't just about a boat, it was about respect. He had fought for this country, had given years of his life to protect people he didn't even know. And now here he was, a man whose years of service seemed to mean nothing in the eyes of the wealthy, the powerful, the privileged. A single careless act had destroyed everything he held dear. He stood there, staring out at the water, his fists clenched at his sides. It wasn't right. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. Thomas wasn't going to let it go. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do yet, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let this rich stranger get away with ruining his life. The thought burned in his chest as he made his way back to shore. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Thomas stood on the dock, his soaked clothes sticking to his skin, as he watched the wreckage of his boat slowly drift away. The once pristine vessel that had been his peace, his refuge, was now just a mess of broken wood and torn ropes. He felt a knot in his stomach. This wasn't just an accident. It was an act of careless destruction, and it hurt more than he expected. He had spent years taking care of that boat, making sure everything was just right. And now, in a matter of seconds, it was gone. The water, which had once been his escape, now felt cold and unforgiving. Thomas gripped the edge of the dock and looked out toward the yacht. It was still moving in the distance, as if nothing had happened. People were still laughing and partying on board, completely unaware of the damage they had caused. The anger in Thomas began to rise. He wanted to scream, to demand they come back and face what they had done. But he knew it wouldn't change anything. They wouldn't even care. He turned away from the harbor and began to walk back to his truck. His boots echoed on the wood of the dock, each step heavy with frustration. His mind raced, filled with a mix of anger and disbelief. How could someone be so careless? How could someone be so blind to the world around them? It wasn't just about the boat. It was about the way the rich and powerful seemed to think they could do whatever they wanted without consequence. As he got into his truck, he slammed the door shut. The engine roared to life, but even the sound of the motor didn't drown out the thoughts racing through his head. He needed to do something. He couldn't just let this slide. But what? Who would care about the complaint of one man and his little boat? What chance did he have against someone who owned a yacht that big? Still, he couldn't just walk away. That wasn't who he was. Thomas made a few phone calls. His voice was steady as he explained what had happened to his friends, people he had known during his time in the Navy. They were shocked, just as he had been, but they understood. They had seen the kind of person he was, someone who didn't back down from a fight, especially when it was for something that mattered. After a few more calls, Thomas had a plan. He wasn't sure exactly how things would unfold, but he knew he wouldn't be the only one standing up for what was right. He spent the next couple of hours gathering what was left of his boat. The damage was worse than he had imagined. Large chunks of wood had been broken apart, and the hull was cracked. It was clear the boat wasn't going to be the same again. Even if he repaired it, it would never be the way it was. But Thomas wasn't concerned about that right now. He was focused on something bigger. He took out a piece of paper and wrote down a few words: justice. It wasn't just a word. It was a mission now. And Thomas wasn't going to stop until he got it. The next morning, Thomas woke up with a sharp feeling in his chest. The anger from yesterday hadn't faded. If anything, it had only grown stronger, more urgent. He couldn't let it go. The yacht owner, the people on that boat, they needed to know what their actions had caused. It wasn't just about his boat anymore. It was about respect. Thomas had given too much of himself for this country, only to be ignored by those who thought their wealth gave them the right to do anything they wanted. He couldn't let them get away with it. He reached for his phone and began dialing. First, he called his old Navy friend Daniel. They had served together for years, and if there was anyone who understood what Thomas was feeling, it was Daniel. "Hey Daniel, it's Thomas," he said when the phone picked up. "Something happened yesterday. My boat got destroyed by a yacht. No warning, no care. I need your help." Daniel was quiet for a moment, processing what Thomas had said. "Are you serious? That's messed up, man. What are you gonna do?" "I don't know yet, but I'm not letting this slide. I'm thinking of going after the owner, getting the word out. You know people who can help, right?" "I can make some calls," Daniel replied, his voice filled with determination. "We won't let them just walk away from this." Thomas felt a small weight lift off his shoulders. He wasn't alone in this. His fellow veterans understood. They had his back, and now they would help him make sure the right thing was done. Thomas knew he needed more than just moral support. He needed people who could help him find answers. He hung up with Daniel and immediately called a few more people from his past, the kind of people who could get things done, no matter how big or small the problem was. Within an hour, Thomas had a team on his side. Some were former military, others were just good people he knew from the neighborhood. All of them were willing to help in any way they could. Together, they'd figure out what to do next. After a few more calls, Thomas decided it was time to reach out to the authorities. He wasn't sure they would take him seriously at first, but he had to try. After all, this was more than just a boat. This was about accountability. It wasn't right that someone could do something so reckless and walk away without facing consequences. He wasn't going to let the wealthy yacht owner get off scot-free. As he made the call, his hands tightened around the phone. He could hear the operator's voice on the other end, asking for the details. "My boat was hit by a yacht," Thomas explained calmly. "It was destroyed. I need to file a report." The operator asked a few more questions, taking down the information. Thomas could hear the skepticism in her voice, but he didn't care. He'd been in tough situations before. This was just one more battle. He ended the call, feeling a sense of purpose settle over him. This wasn't going to be easy, but it was the right thing to do. And Thomas wasn't about to let it go. He had a mission now. The next day, Thomas woke up to a sound that made his heart skip a beat. The unmistakable hum of military helicopters overhead. He jumped out of bed, rushing to the window. Outside, the sky was filled with Navy choppers, their rotors cutting through the morning air. Thomas's pulse quickened. This was no coincidence. This was the Navy, and they weren't just here for a routine patrol. He grabbed his jacket and ran out the door, heading straight for the harbor. As he reached the docks, the sight that greeted him took his breath away. Navy ships had anchored in the bay, their massive bodies casting long shadows over the water. A small crowd had gathered on the shore, staring in disbelief at the sudden arrival of the military. Thomas's heart swelled with a strange mix of excitement and nervousness. This wasn't just a local incident anymore. The Navy was here, and they were taking it seriously. He could feel the weight of the situation settling over him. This was bigger than just his boat. This was about right and wrong, and the military wasn't about to let a careless rich man get away with his actions. As Thomas approached the dock, he saw Navy officers moving with purpose, speaking with local law enforcement, and setting up an operation. A group of Navy investigators was gathered around the table, reviewing what appeared to be footage from cameras around the harbor. Thomas was still in shock. He had never imagined that the Navy would take such an interest in a single incident involving a small boat. But there they were, and it made him feel like his fight might actually have a chance. He walked toward the nearest officer, a tall man in a Navy uniform, who was busy checking something on a clipboard. "Excuse me," Thomas called out, his voice firm but respectful. "I'm Thomas, the man whose boat was destroyed." The officer looked up, nodding in recognition. "We've heard about what happened, sir. We're taking this seriously. We're going to get to the bottom of it." Thomas could hardly believe his ears. "You mean, you're really going after the yacht owner?" he asked, his voice filled with a mix of hope and disbelief. "Yes," the officer replied, his expression grim. "We have enough evidence to start an investigation. The yacht's owner is going to have to answer for what happened." Thomas felt a rush of relief. He had never expected the Navy to show up like this, but he wasn't about to question it. This was exactly what he had hoped for. It wasn't just about getting justice for his boat anymore. It was about showing that no one, no matter how rich or powerful, was above the law. As the officers continued to work, Thomas noticed the luxury yacht off in the distance, still anchored near the harbor. Its owners were likely enjoying their day, unaware that the military had come to make sure their recklessness would be addressed. Thomas felt a growing sense of satisfaction. He hadn't just fought for his boat, he had fought for something bigger, and with the Navy now involved, he knew this fight was far from over. As the day went on, the Navy made it clear that they were taking full control of the situation. This wasn't just a small matter. It was a message to anyone who thought they could get away with causing harm and walking away. Thomas had started this battle on his own, but now, with the full weight of the Navy behind him, he felt ready for whatever came next. The morning after the Navy arrived, Thomas stood by the harbor, watching as investigators worked around the clock. Navy officers were everywhere, taking statements, reviewing footage from security cameras, and inspecting the wreckage of his boat. The once peaceful bay had transformed into a bustling scene of military precision. Thomas couldn't believe how fast things were moving. What had started as a simple, personal act of frustration had turned into something much bigger than he had imagined. He stood there for hours, pacing along the dock, his eyes never leaving the Navy personnel. Every now and then, someone would look over at him, nodding in acknowledgement. It was clear they were taking this seriously, but Thomas didn't know what to expect. He had spent so many years serving his country, and this was the first time he had ever felt like someone in power was actually listening to him. The Navy wasn't going to let the yacht owner slip away. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug. Finally, Thomas was approached by one of the investigators, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and sharp eyes. The man extended his hand. "Thomas, right? I'm Lieutenant Wilkins. We've been gathering the evidence. We have multiple witnesses who saw the yacht crash into your boat. We also got video footage from a few local fishermen who were nearby." Thomas nodded, his heart racing as he processed the information. It felt surreal to hear those words. His story was finally being heard, and the evidence was stacking up against the yacht owner. "So, what happens now?" Thomas asked, his voice shaky but determined. Lieutenant Wilkins' expression softened. "We're going to make sure everything is documented. The yacht owner will be contacted soon, and we'll hold them accountable. We'll also look into the boat's registration and the captain's details. From what we've seen, this wasn't an accident, it was reckless driving, and that's a crime." Thomas felt a surge of hope. For the first time since the collision, he allowed himself to feel something other than anger. Maybe, just maybe, this would work out. He had always believed in doing what was right, no matter how hard it was. And now the Navy was on his side, working to make sure the person responsible for destroying his boat faced the consequences. He spent the next few hours in a daze, watching as the investigation unfolded. The officers spoke to the few fishermen who had been around when the yacht collided with his boat. They had all given similar accounts of the event, describing the yacht's reckless speed and the lack of concern for smaller vessels in the area. Even a few locals, who had been enjoying the morning on the beach, confirmed they had seen the yacht veer dangerously close to other boats before crashing into Thomas's. It was clear that this wasn't just a minor mistake, it was a deliberate act of carelessness. Thomas couldn't help but think of how easily the yacht owner had gotten away with it all. But now, with the Navy involved, it seemed like the tables were turning. As the day came to a close, Lieutenant Wilkins told Thomas they would be preparing the case and would soon be in touch with him. "This isn't over," the lieutenant said with a reassuring tone. "We'll make sure the right thing is done." Thomas felt a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time in days, he felt like he had a real chance at justice. He wasn't alone anymore. The Navy was behind him, and he would make sure this wasn't just a story that disappeared with the tide. 2 days later, Thomas stood at the edge of the harbor, his eyes locked on the sleek, white yacht. It had returned to the bay, docked on the far side, where its owner had apparently come to settle things. Thomas's heart beat faster. The Navy had been working tirelessly, gathering evidence, and now it was time for the confrontation. This yacht owner, the person who had caused so much destruction with a careless act, was finally going to face the consequences. As the Navy personnel moved into position, Thomas couldn't help but feel a mix of nerves and excitement. This was his moment, his chance to make sure that what had happened to him didn't just disappear. He had fought for this moment, worked tirelessly for it, and now it was happening. He wasn't just fighting for his boat anymore, he was fighting for justice. Lieutenant Wilkins walked over to him, giving him a nod of reassurance. "We're ready to go. We got everything lined up." Thomas nodded, his eyes still focused on the yacht. It almost seemed like the owner didn't know what was coming. He saw a group of people on board, laughing and chatting, completely unaware of the serious consequences they were about to face. "You're sure about this?" Thomas asked, his voice low. "We got everything we need," Lieutenant Wilkins replied. "Witnesses, footage, everything. Now it's time to hold them accountable." Thomas took a deep breath, steeling himself. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but it had to be done. He had to make sure that no one else would ever feel the way he had felt when his boat was destroyed, helpless and forgotten. The Navy officers approached the yacht, their movements precise and professional. As they boarded, Thomas followed behind, his stomach tight with anticipation. When they reached the deck, Thomas spotted a man in his late 40s wearing a crisp, expensive suit. He was clearly the owner. The man looked surprised to see the group of officers and Thomas approaching. "Excuse me, sir," Lieutenant Wilkins said firmly, his voice steady. "I'm Lieutenant Wilkins with the Navy. This is Thomas, the owner of the boat you hit. We need to discuss the incident that took place in the harbor a couple of days ago." The yacht owner's face twisted into a look of confusion, then irritation. "Wait a minute," he began, standing up straighter. "I don't know what you're talking about. I was just out here enjoying my time. I didn't hit anyone's boat." "We have video footage," Lieutenant Wilkins responded, his tone unwavering. "We have witnesses, and we have evidence of reckless behavior. You'll need to come with us." The yacht owner's expression faltered for a moment. It was clear he hadn't expected things to escalate like this, but it was too late to back out now. The Navy wasn't going to let him slip away. Thomas watched closely, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He wasn't alone anymore. The yacht owner's attempt to remain calm quickly disappeared as he realized the situation was spiraling out of his control. He glanced around, clearly searching for a way out, but no one was buying his story. "You're making a big mistake," he said, his voice rising slightly. "No, sir," Thomas said, stepping forward, his voice steady. "The mistake was made the day you decided to ignore everyone else on the water and wreck my boat. But today, it's your turn to face the consequences." The tension in the air was thick, but Thomas stood tall. This wasn't just about a boat anymore. It was about making sure that people like this yacht owner knew they couldn't get away with their recklessness. The yacht owner was now surrounded by officers, his face a mixture of frustration and disbelief. Thomas could see the panic starting to creep into his eyes as the reality of the situation sank in. This wasn't going to go away with a few excuses or some money thrown around. The Navy had him cornered, and Thomas wasn't backing down. The officers calmly escorted the man off his yacht, and Thomas watched as they placed him in the back of a Navy vehicle. There was a strange sense of satisfaction that filled Thomas's chest as he stood there, watching the man being taken away. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, and for the first time since the crash, Thomas felt like he had finally gotten it. This rich, careless man, who had thought he could do whatever he wanted, was going to face the consequences. As the vehicle drove away, Thomas turned to Lieutenant Wilkins, who was standing nearby. "It's over, isn't it?" Thomas asked, his voice calm but filled with a quiet pride. "It's not over yet," Wilkins replied, giving him a reassuring look. "There's still the legal process, but this is a huge step forward. We have everything we need to make sure he's held accountable." Thomas nodded, feeling the weight of the situation begin to lift from his shoulders. It hadn't been easy. The anger, the frustration, the constant uncertainty, it had all been so overwhelming. But now it felt like it was finally coming to an end. The yacht owner would face the charges for reckless driving, and the damage to Thomas's boat would be paid for. Justice had been done. As Thomas looked back toward the harbor, he saw his boat's wreckage being towed away. There was a pang in his chest. It would never be the same. No amount of money or legal action could bring back the peaceful days he had spent on that boat, the memories that it held. But at least now, he knew the person who had destroyed it wouldn't just walk away without facing the truth. The Navy officers, though busy with their work, offered him quiet words of encouragement. Thomas felt a deep sense of gratitude toward them. They had made sure his voice was heard, had ensured that his fight wasn't in vain. They had shown him that sometimes even the smallest actions could lead to something big. He hadn't expected the Navy to get involved, but they had, and that made all the difference. As the sun began to set over the harbor, casting long shadows over the water, Thomas took a moment to breathe deeply. He had come a long way from the day his boat had been destroyed. He had fought for what was right, and he had won. It was over now, but he knew this experience would stay with him. Not just the anger or the pain, but the sense of justice that had been done. It was a reminder that no matter how powerless someone might feel, Standing up for what's right could change everything. Thomas turned and walked away from the harbor, his steps steady and sure. The battle had been hard, but the victory was sweet.